Sometimes the path ahead is hidden, and the only way to reveal it is to take a step into the unknown. The day was drawing to a close, and the once bright sun had begun to melt into the horizon, casting long shadows across the earth. The wilderness was bathed in the amber glow of evening, and the air was warm and still, carrying with it the faint scent of wildflowers and dust. Jesus and his disciples had been traveling for many days, through valleys, along rocky paths, and across fields that stretched out as far as the eye could see. They had witnessed miracles and heard profound teachings, but tonight, the journey seemed different. There was a quiet heaviness in the air, as if something important was about to unfold. As they walked, the disciples noticed the landscape beginning to change. The familiar hills gave way to a vast expanse, and in the distance, they could hear the faint but unmistakable roar of water. They followed the sound, and soon the group found themselves standing at the edge of a wide, fast-moving river. The river was wild and furious, the kind that seemed impossible to cross. The water rushed and churned with such intensity that it was difficult to even stand close to the bank without feeling the pull of its current. The disciples stared at the river in silence, the realization dawning on them that they would need to cross it to continue their journey. But how? Peter, standing at the front of the group, furrowed his brow and shook his head. "How are we supposed to cross this?" he asked, his voice laced with frustration. "There's no bridge, no boat, nothing." James, who was usually quiet, stepped forward and added, "The current is too strong. If we tried to swim, we'd be swept away before we even made it halfway." The other disciples murmured in agreement, their eyes filled with uncertainty and fear. They had faced many challenges before, but this felt different. The river before them seemed to symbolize something more, something deeper. It wasn't just a physical obstacle, it felt like a representation of all the unseen challenges they would face on their journey ahead. Jesus, standing a little apart from the group, looked at the river with a calm expression. He could feel the fear and doubt rising in the hearts of his disciples, and he knew that this moment was about more than just crossing a river. It was a moment of faith, a moment where they would have to choose between trusting in what they could see and believing in what they could not. With a gentle smile, Jesus turned to his disciples and said, "Come, sit with me for a moment." He gestured to a cluster of large stones near the riverbank, and the disciples, though confused, obeyed. They gathered around him, sitting on the rocks and looking at him expectantly. Jesus looked at each of them in turn, his eyes filled with love and understanding. He could see the weariness in their faces, the uncertainty in their hearts. And so, he began to speak. "There was once a man," Jesus said, his voice calm and soothing, "who stood at the edge of a great river. Much like this one, it was wide, wild, and dangerous. The man had been on a long journey, searching for a place he had heard about, a place of peace and joy, a place where his heart would find rest. But as he stood at the river's edge, looking at the wild waters before him, he felt a deep sense of fear and despair." The disciples, now fully engaged in the story, listened intently. They could picture the man standing there, much like they were now, staring at the daunting river before him. "The man looked around for a way to cross," Jesus continued, "but there was none. There was no bridge, no boat, and the water was too dangerous to swim. He felt trapped, as if all the progress he had made on his journey had come to a sudden halt. He could see the land of peace on the other side, but the river was keeping him from it. The more he looked at the river, the more fear began to take hold of him." The disciples shifted uncomfortably, feeling the man's fear as if it were their own. They, too, had often felt trapped by their circumstances, unsure of how to move forward when the path seemed impossible. "The man cried out to God," Jesus said softly, asking for a way across. He prayed for a bridge to appear, for the waters to part, for some miraculous sign that would show him the way. But there was no answer. The river continued to rage, and no bridge appeared. The man grew frustrated and afraid. He thought God had abandoned him. At this, The disciples exchanged uneasy glances. They knew the feeling of crying out to God in moments of desperation, only to be met with what seemed like silence. It was a feeling they had all experienced at some point on their journey. But then, Jesus said, his voice filled with quiet wonder, something happened. A single plank of wood appeared before the man, hovering just above the water. It wasn't a full bridge, just one plank, stretching a few feet out into the river. The disciples leaned in, their curiosity piqued. A plank? How could that possibly help the man cross such a vast and dangerous river? The man was confused. Jesus continued. How can I cross with just one plank? He thought. He wanted to see the whole bridge, something solid and certain, something that would take him all the way to the other side. But then, a quiet voice stirred in his heart, saying, "Take the first step. Trust that the way will be revealed as you walk." The disciples were silent, their hearts racing as they imagined themselves in the man's position. It wasn't just about crossing a river, it was about stepping into the unknown, trusting in something they couldn't yet see. The man hesitated, Jesus said, his voice softening. He was afraid of what might happen if he stepped onto the plank. What if it wasn't strong enough? What if he fell into the river? What if he couldn't make it across? But despite his fear, something deeper within him urged him to trust. And so, with trembling hands and a heart full of uncertainty, he took a step onto the plank. The disciples held their breath, their minds racing with questions. Would the plank hold him? Would more planks appear? How would the man make it across? As soon as his foot touched the wood, Jesus said, his voice filled with quiet awe, another plank appeared in front of him. He took another step, and another plank appeared. With each step of faith, the bridge began to form beneath his feet, stretching further and further across the river. The disciples were captivated, their eyes wide as they imagined the bridge forming plank by plank. It was as if they could feel the man's fear giving way to trust, his doubts being replaced by a growing sense of hope. The man walked slowly at first, Jesus continued, each step a mix of fear and faith. But with every step he took, he realized something. The fear that had once paralyzed him was beginning to lift. The more he trusted, the lighter his heart became. The river was still wild beneath him, but it no longer frightened him. The path was revealing itself, not all at once, but one step at a time. The disciples sat in silence, the weight of the story settling over them like a blanket. They could feel the truth of it in their own hearts. How often had they waited for the entire path to be clear before moving forward? How many times had they been afraid to take that first step, not knowing if the way would be revealed? When the man reached the other side, Jesus said, he turned to look back at the bridge, expecting to see the path he had just walked. But to his astonishment, the bridge had vanished. The planks were gone, and the river flowed as it always had. The man realized then that the bridge had not been made of wood. The real bridge had been his faith. Each plank had appeared only because he trusted enough to take the next step. The disciples were silent, deeply moved by the story. They looked at the river before them, its waters still wild and untamed, but something had shifted within them. The fear that had once gripped their hearts now felt lighter, less overpowering. Peter, who had been listening intently, finally spoke. His voice was quiet but filled with wonder. "Lord, are you saying that we must take the first step, even if we cannot see the whole path?" Jesus smiled gently, his eyes full of love and understanding. "Yes, Peter. The path will not always be clear, and the way will not always be easy. But faith is not about seeing the entire journey. It is about trusting that the way will be revealed, step by step. Just as the man in the story found his bridge through faith, so too will you find the path before you when you trust in God. But what if we fall?" John asked, his voice trembling with uncertainty. "What if we take that first step and the plank doesn't appear? What if we fail?" Jesus looked at John with compassion. "John, the fear of falling is natural, But faith is not the absence of fear. It is the courage to move forward despite it. And know this, even if you stumble, even if you fall, God will be there to catch you. The journey is not about perfection. It is about trust. Tears filled the eyes of some of the disciples, and they nodded, understanding the deeper meaning of the story. Life was full of rivers, full of obstacles that seemed impossible to cross. But the lesson was clear. The path would always be there, even if they couldn't see it right away. It would reveal itself in time, as long as they had the faith to take the first step. Jesus rose to his feet, his gaze still fixed on the river. "Now, my friends," he said softly, "it is time for us to cross our own river. You may not see the way forward, but it is there. Trust, and take the first step." The disciples stood, their hearts pounding with a mix of fear and hope. The river still roared before them, its waters as wild as ever, but they knew now that this was not a test of physical strength, it was a test of faith. Peter, always the boldest among them, stepped forward. He took a deep breath, remembering the man in the story. "Take the first step," he told himself. He raised his foot, hesitating for just a moment, and then lowered it toward the water. To his amazement, a single plank of wood appeared, hovering just above the water's surface, solid and real. A gasp escaped the disciples, but it was a gasp of awe, not fear. Peter stood on the plank, his heart racing. He took another step, and just as Jesus had said, another plank appeared. One by one, the other disciples followed, each of them stepping out onto the river, each plank of the bridge forming beneath their feet only when they moved forward in faith. The river continued to rage beneath them, but it no longer seemed as dangerous, no longer as threatening. As they walked, the disciples felt something shift inside them. The fear that had once seemed so powerful began to dissolve, replaced by a deep sense of trust. With every step, they felt lighter, as if the very act of moving forward in faith was lifting the burdens from their hearts. When they finally reached the other side, they turned back to look at the bridge, but just as in the story, it had vanished. The river flowed as it always had, but the path they had walked was gone. Jesus stood beside them, his face radiant with love and pride. "Remember this moment," he said softly. "There will be many rivers in your life, many moments where the way forward seems impossible. But the path is always there, even if you cannot see it. Trust in God, and the way will be revealed, one step at a time." Tears flowed freely now, not from sadness but from joy. The disciples had learned a powerful lesson, one that would carry them through every trial they would face. The vanishing bridge was not just a miracle, it was a symbol of their journey, a reminder that the real path was built through faith, through trust in God's unseen hand. As they continued their journey, their hearts were lighter, their spirits stronger. The rivers ahead no longer seemed as daunting, for they knew now that they had the courage and faith to cross them. The real bridge, the bridge of trust and faith, had been within them all along. This is end of the story. Comment Amen if you believe in Jesus' blessings. Please like this video and subscribe this channel for more Jesus story like this. May the God watch over you.